What is up, Baton Rouge? Welcome back to the Tiger Pride podcast presented by 225 Magazine. I'm Mark Clements, back with Jarrett Roser after a brief hiatus due to holidays and New Year's and high school football championships. Jarrett's been all around the state covering that. How was that? Seemed like you had some good games on your docket.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we got to that point. Is kind of my biggest takeaway. I've told so many people there was a point where we didn't know what we were going to get of a season. And so the fact that we to wrap it up with 9 state championships was great in and of itself. And some fantastic teams up there making the trip to Natchitoches and battling it out for those 9 state championships, and some really fantastic players. And several of them are either signed or committed to play at the next level in Baton Rouge. And so that was really exciting from an LSU perspective for fans to see guys like Jack Besh and Aaron Anderson and Walker Howard and company all performing at a very high level.
Also, a few kids from a certain one Baton Rouge area school that did pretty well.
Oh, yeah. Madison Prep was fantastic in the 3A game on Wednesday. But yeah, to your point, your alma mater, Catholic High, won another state championship and had some really great performances from guys that won't end up at LSU and some guys that very well could end up at LSU over the next couple of years as well.
Yeah, I haven't been following them quite as much as I used to, but I hear they got some stud underclassmen that are coming through the ranks. Should be exciting to watch in the next few years. So we got a lot. You mentioned you joked it's been 8 weeks. It's been close to that since we've last caught up. There's a lot of little things that I wanted to touch on for this podcast, but what I was going to do initially before this news broke today was kind of start back where we first left off and work our way forward. But might as well start with the newest breaking news of the past couple hours as we record this Wednesday afternoon. That LSU has hired Jake Peetz as its offensive coordinator and DJ Menges as its passing game coordinator. 2 names that I think were kind of at the front of the list when this whole process started, as Steve Ensminger takes a step kind of down into an analyst role, and I guess Scott Linehan that just parted ways with him. So Peetz they both kind of come from that Joe Brady coaching tree, I guess. Peetz, a QB coach for the Panthers, where Joe Brady obviously is now. He's got 10 years of NFL experience. He's the running backs and quarterbacks coach over there in Carolina. He's been an offensive assistant for Jacksonville, Washington, Oakland, and in college, twice of which was at Alabama. And then Menges, a guy who is also with the Panthers as an assistant. A lot of people know him from his time in Baton Rouge working with Joe Burrow, Jared Brady, and that awesome offense of last year. I guess this probably doesn't really surprise you that these 2 names are the ones to come out of it, but this has to get you pretty excited about the potential of what this offense can do if you kind of look at these 2 dudes as baby Brady's, kind of in that same coaching trio.
Yeah, I saw a couple reactions initially, I think probably from outside of the LSU fan base, asking who these guys were. But I think for folks tapped into LSU and I mean, the level of excitement that was there just a year ago and Joe Brady's 1 year with the program, there are a lot of reasons to be excited. LSU very quickly in its release, it was funny to see how much they tied Joe Brady into a release that had nothing to do with Joe Brady because of the success that was there in 2019 and the fact that, as Coach Orgeron mentioned, both these guys come highly recommended from Brady. You mentioned DJ was here in that year in 2019, obviously a great relationship there, and a guy that has been kind of a right-hand man for Joe Brady these last couple of years. And then Jake Peetz, you're talking about 2 relatively young, particularly when you look at the guys that were running the offense this past year for LSU, 2 relatively young coordinators now joining the ranks. They have professional experience. They have experience at the highest levels of college football. And I think you look at Carolina's relative lack of success offensively this year, but you have to recognize that it's a first year with a new staff in a COVID season, and Christian McCaffrey only played 3 games, and factor all that in before you start to look too closely at the numbers of their year together. And I think going that younger, more up and coming type route is kind of where you need to be if you're making hires right now. You're trying to go against the grain that we saw fail ultimately this past year, where LSU got some well-established guys sort of on the downside of their hill of careers. You want guys that are kind of ascending, young, hungry guys that have their best years still ahead of them. And I think both of these guys fit those sort of bills and come with connections to someone that has coached LSU offensive football at as high a level as anyone in the history of the program.
Yeah, I think the going younger was definitely by design. And I would imagine that as of now, there has not been a defensive coordinator hire. We'll get into that in a minute, but I imagine it's also going to tailor a trend to the younger side of things, as opposed to Bo Pelini, who wasn't ancient, but like you said, on the tail end of his the downslope of his coaching career. But
yeah, I don't mean to make it sound like we're trying to kick Bo out of coaching entirely right now, but if you're looking at kind of the rise and the plateau and then the backside, he is certainly much farther along in his career and probably on, if you're splitting it into halves, on the back half.
Yeah, and even Steve Ensminger, there was all this talk, and I think it's not an unknown fact that he not that he didn't want the OC job, but he was pretty content with where he was. He's a little bit older, and he had his 3-year contract, and I think he's cool with letting that kind of ride out. And I like that he's still going to stay on staff and as an analyst or whatever role they're going to put him at, just to kind of keep the bulk of the offense there, have that guy that you can always fall back on to pick his brain, help keep things running smoothly, and let these 2 quote unquote wonder kids, these up and comers, kind of do their thing and hopefully channel their inner Joe Brady from a couple of years back or last year. Offensively, it's amazing how much of an impact that Joe Brady has had on Baton Rouge and LSU, and despite spending maybe 12 months here last year when he was here, but because to have that relationship with Coach O that seems to be still strong, if Coach O is calling him up to get recommendations, and then now we're taking his recommendations back to Baton Rouge. It's incredible that impact he has, and makes you excited about the future of LSU's offense.
Just got to figure out who that Joe Burrow is going to be now.
I know, right?
As meteoric a rise as Joe Brady has had, I think you look at that year and just such a perfect storm of so many great pieces coming together, and Joe Burrow playing a huge role for that offense. That, I mean, I think ultimately the whole proved bigger than the sum of all those parts, and they all did a fantastic job. But I think there were so many times this year, and I think about it particularly with the offensive line, where you saw how special Joe Burrow was to make everyone else around him look good. And I think Joe Brady did a great job in a lot of those respects too. But you're certainly not going to be walking in 2021 and working with exactly the same talent level that Joe Brady had in 2019. And so there's certainly always going to be talent in Baton Rouge, but we'll see who exactly is at the helm of different positions in this coming year, as well as, hopefully you have these guys around coaching this offense for a few years and they can kind of grow together with these up and coming kids.
That was one of the things I was going to say also when you mentioned the relative not success of Carolina, is he also didn't have, not to knock Teddy, but he didn't quite have Joe Burrow back there slinging it. And then you mentioned McCaffrey and some of the other pieces that kind of didn't work out for him. But I'm already curious. I had it later on the docket, but since you touched on it now, I can already see the quarterback as good as Max Johnson and at times Finley looked this year when Brennan went down. I can already see the quarterback controversy that's going to be brewing in the offseason. Even though I imagine if Miles Brennan's healthy and comes back and all this stuff, I would imagine he'd be the front runner in the clubhouse. But as soon as he struggles, people are going to be calling for some of these backups. And I'm just curious to see how this sort of the offense unfolds with whoever winds up getting that starting job and kind of how everything looks. But I guess I joke about the quarterback controversy, but it's good to have that sort of I don't know if you want to call it a problem, but that debate to have multiple talented quarterbacks that you feel like you can trust in as you head into a season with a new high-powered offense.
Yeah, I certainly think that it's Miles's offense to lose right now, sort of thing. He was very highly praised from O and company starting out the year before suffering the injury. And I think even when folks were critical with not being able to punch it in late at Missouri, I think ultimately you and I talked frequently about the fact that there were major issues defensively and that Miles was #Miles Brennan is a good quarterback sort of thing was kind of the joke that we piggybacked on. But I was talking to the parent of a young high school quarterback right now, not a guy who's in play with LSU at the moment. So, I mean, I'm not talking about a conversation with Jamie Howard, but just in kind of the general grand scheme of things, it's going to be a really weird couple of years to be, I mean, any prospect or any young college football player, but particularly the quarterback position where we've seen so much develop over time of transferring because you have a limited amount of time and only one of those guys is going to get on the field sort of thing. The fact that COVID has kind of bottlenecked some of these recruiting classes together by giving a guy like Miles Brennan an extra year is going to be really interesting to watch in a lot of ways. And there's going to be some adjustments to the NCAA transfer rules that are going to allow things to open up even more freely now in the years to come. And so when you have a Miles Brennan who now has an additional 2 years of eligibility left because of COVID, and I guess theoretically could have had because of a medical red shirt potentially if they went that route, but you have 2 freshman quarterbacks who theoretically could technically still be considered freshmen next year, and a new freshman coming in Nussmeier, and you've got Walker Howard committed for 2022. It's a heck of a logjam at some positions like that, most notably quarterback. And so watching how those conversations play out here in the next few weeks and ultimately the next couple of years is going to be really interesting, not just at LSU, but a lot of places.
Yeah, and I think it's almost inevitable that one, if not multiple of those guys end up transferring. At the same note, wouldn't be shocked if some other quarterback transfers into LSU at some point, a la Joe Burrow. I guess a lot of this is curious about when it happens and where some of these guys, wind up falling. And then, speaking of transfers, I was going to get into the Eric Gilbert news next. I guess real quick before we go into that, let's talk about the defensive coordinator spot while we're kind of on coordinators. And the hottest name that is rumored to be interviewing this week, I guess when this publishes on Thursday, it'll be today, is Marcus Freeman, defensive coordinator for Cincinnati, who interviewed with Notre Dame earlier in the week and is kind of one of the biggest names in college football, at least on the defensive side of the ball. Not that you have any news on if he's going to be hired or whatever, but was out of all the names that were kind of rumored, I think there was Barry Odom was one that was tossed around a little bit. A few different names were thrown out there. Was he kind of the head honcho of that group in your mind, or is there somebody else you kind of had your eye on, hoping LSU at least scouts out?
Yeah, I think he was pretty high on that list, certainly. And honestly, just the way a lot of this fell with some of those reasons that we haven't had a podcast in a few weeks in terms of just different signing day stuff and the wedding that I had and the holidays and the state championships. I haven't been that tapped into some of this, but I like what Barry Odom has done throughout his career. And I mean, he's a guy he's been around a few years now too, but he's seemed to do a good job of everywhere he lands, making some pretty strong improvements on that side of the ball. Including this past year. But Freeman is a guy that, for me, as I looked at, I guess, prioritizing some of those young guys on the rise, he stood out to me in that regard. And so he was definitely very much kind of in that top of mind group, as I was confident that LSU would not go a retread type scenario of the nature of bringing Bo Pelini back for the first time in a decade. But it was good to kind of see some of those names pop up, like Jake or DJ on the offensive side, or like Marcus Freeman on defense.
Yeah, I agree. The one thing that I kind of had my eye on when they were scouting out is finding somebody who's young and kind of knows how to defend the modern offense. Because as we've seen how different offenses have become in college football nowadays, just somebody who's worked against that and kind of I don't know, when you have one of these up and coming names who's not at a major school yet but has all this potential, it just brings a level of excitement to the program that that I think is encouraging not only to the recruits but to the fans. And then, as we'll get into it in a minute, but a lot of these guys, returning players who have the option to go pro, I think a lot of them, when you can see some of these hires being made, of course they have their own independent decisions to make in terms of what's best for them and their families. But I think it does help when you make these exciting young hires to kind of bring some of these kids back and see what could be if I come back and play on this defense or this offense with this new scheme kind of thing. It'll maximize my skill set type deal. So Freeman was kind of the head of my personal little wish list. I was thinking it'd be exciting to watch him with the talent LSU could have coming back on defense. And then I think he's just going to continue to rise and probably be at either NFL or a head coach in college somewhere within a couple of years. So even if this is a short-term hire, a couple-year hire, I think you still do it and you kind of maximize the talent you have on defense right now.
Yeah, I think sort of a couple of things. First of all, in terms of finding good college coaches, the roles are so twofold in the sense of recruiting is a piece of it and actual technical coaching and instruction is a piece of it. And it seems like having guys, not in all cases by any means, but more young coaches seem to do a better job of recruiting just in terms of those relationships, being more relatable to these young guys. We've seen instances where some former NFL coaches become college assistants and recruiting is just really not their cup of tea. And then dealing with sort of the goofiness that goes with an 18-year-old or 19-year-old kid, some of that becomes kind of a frustration more than kind of an enjoyable aspect. And so I think just from a relationship standpoint, even for guys that don't necessarily have the same track record, if you can find something to hang your hat on in terms of pitching your experience, like a Joe Brady, who was so young and had some NFL experience, but as important as his time with the Saints was just that relatability with some of these young guys on the recruiting trail. That's a huge piece of what it means to be a college coach, is getting that talent there in the first place. And then if you have a young guy that can relate to these guys and is excited about recruiting and has that energy to bring to the recruiting trail as well as to the position room, and they have that expertise that both of these guys we're told have, and we've seen it play out in some aspects, that's the combination you're looking for. And so I think they've got that in the two guys that they announced. And I think you see that in a Freeman if he ends up being a guy that LSU can bring down to Baton Rouge. And then I know some folks kind of get frustrated with the idea of somebody leaving quickly, but that's kind of part of the game. I don't think anyone would trade away the 2019 season to not have as down of a 2020. And so you certainly take what Joe Brady and company brought to Baton Rouge that year. But if you're a successful program, other teams should want your assistants to come, and you should be trying to compete to keep them or to find that next new up and coming guy. Because if no one wants your assistants, then you're probably doing a pretty, I don't know if I can say like the word I was going to say, but a blank poor job as a program if nobody wants the guys that are a part of building what you are. And so that's just kind of comes with the territory.
I mean, if you're going to call Alabama kind of the gold standard of what you want LSU to become, every single year they have coordinators, assistants, analysts, whatever, getting picked to go have a bigger job somewhere else at a bigger school or in the NFL or something. So yeah,
you need to be a skilled talent evaluator of your coaching staff as much as you are of your players, essentially.
And I love, you touched on kind of the balance of having a coordinator who can recruit and relate to the kids. And in the era of, social media, I don't know that Bo Pelini is super active on Instagram and TikTok and knowing, what the trends are and that kind of thing. And I like that aspect of it. And I think also in terms of relatability, when we saw all the social issues that hit this past year, LSU's coaching staff is so old, and I cannot imagine relate to these kids in the sense of their political outlook or like even where these kids come from and some of their backgrounds. And so I think just having a younger coach can relate in a lot of those ways that I think Coach O didn't do a great job of this past year. So there's a lot of things to like, and again, we don't know if it's Freeman yet, but I think there's a lot of things to like about that potential. And Coach O put the timeline out there on OTB with Jordy and T-Bob saying he wants to have the hires by the end of the week. So maybe if this comes out Thursday, maybe by Friday or the weekend, we'll know a little more and we can dissect it next week. But they seem to move pretty quick because I think Pete's and Menges interviewed like Tuesday, maybe Monday, and by Wednesday it's official. So hopefully this DC hire can be just as quick.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of the developments in terms of technology that we kind of joke about with TikTok and whatnot, but society as a whole and some of those social issues that became a kind of a point of tension in the program over the summer. But even, I mean, football has evolved over time. And so there are certain aspects of a good coach or a good person or a good whatever that do sort of stand the test of time. But at the same time, we in every way continue to develop, and you have to keep up with the times in a way too, and have those core values that you stick with, again, whether you're talking about football or life, but find a way to adapt to the other things happening around you and make sure that you are current, because the game does change around you. And so I think you see a lot of benefits to having young coaches right now, in particular for LSU in general, certainly, but for LSU, when you look at some of the issues they had this past year, it certainly makes a ton of sense to bring in some guys that are, again, more on the up and coming side of that experience column, and potentially more relatable with some of these prospects, and just, more up to date on a variety of aspects, whether on the football field or in a conversation about what's going on outside the facility.
And if you're Pete or Menges and you look at some of the talent they have on this offense, got to be pretty excited. We touched on the quarterbacks, and I don't want to, it's too far gone to do a full Ole Miss game recap, but I would be remiss if we didn't mention Kayshon Boutte and the performance he had. 14 catches, 308 yards, 3 touchdowns, and the man was just all over the place, breaking Josh Reed's record for receiving yards in a game for LSU. How impressed were you by that performance? I know that you and I touched on, we've gone through this, I feel like, every single week. First it was Jamar was gone, and then Racy got hurt, and then obviously Jets is gone, Terrace opts out, Eric Gilbert opts out, and so you're just going down the list, and you see some of these talented guys. You see the Trey Palmers, you see Kayshon Boutte, you see Coy Moore. You're like, yeah, there's a lot of potential, but they're freshmen. Hey, how quickly can they adapt to this game, this college game, and this offense? Boutte did pretty damn good.
Yeah, I mean, that was a record that when we didn't see Jamar and Terrace and Jets topple it, we didn't know when we were going to ever see someone break Josh Reed's record. And here comes Kayshon with an insane day to close out the season against Ole Miss. And people talking about, could he be the best of that bunch long term? And I mean, you didn't see those other guys do that in their sophomore or in some cases junior year. And so to see Kayshon do that as a freshman and know that there's still plenty of ceiling still ahead of him as he continues to learn the finer details of being a wide receiver at the highest level, I think that's incredibly encouraging. You mentioned Coy Moore, a guy that I thought we'd see a bigger year from this year, but I know he also battled some things at different points, just kind of health aspects in this COVID season, as well as just some little bumps and bruises along the way that kind of hindered him a little bit. And I know he is anticipating a huge step forward heading into his second year on campus, which is typically what you'd expect from these guys. And So some good talent they bring back, as well as some fantastic recruits that they signed up in December that will join. And I think some of them make a pretty quick impact in their own right.
And so they bring some of those guys back. They're bringing in this talented freshman class. So a lot of these guys are pretty young, but then you return. We've already had announcements from, let's just start with the offense. Liam Shanahan, Chasen Hines, and Ed Ingram have all said they're coming back. So you have the potential to get your entire O-line back. No matter who plays at quarterback, you're going to have a returning starter, at least for whoever, if it was, whether it's Brennan started the season or Johnson or Family, who both started games. You're going to have your running backs back, and you're going to have these receivers who, including Boutte, were super talented. This offense is just, again, a lot of them young, and you're installing a new offense. So I get that there's some caveats to kind of keep into play there, but it seems like you have a lot of things lining up to have a pretty good season and a pretty good offense. And the thing that most excites me is the offensive line coming back and having that stability, not having a big turnover. And you factor in some of these guys who are also coming in or came in the past couple of years on the O-line, the 4 and 5 star guys, pushing these returning starters for some of their spots. It seems like a lot of things going LSU's way after what could have ended the season as a 3-7 team. They end up going 5-5. You end up with a good recruiting class. You're making the coaching moves that a lot of people wanted to see you make, and now you get some of these returning players coming back. It's been nice to have some good news and see where this offense could be heading into next year.
Yeah, I think closing out the season, a bigger concern to me than if LSU had gone to Florida and lost, and if LSU had kind of finished poorly record-wise, was some of the other negativity swirling around the program and the talk of how many guys might leave, whether to go to the NFL or to transfer out. And so to see the recommitment of some of those players that we're talking about now on the offensive line, or some of the guys we've seen on the defensive line that we'll get to, I think is huge. And also, that was one of my biggest takeaways on signing day and the early signing period was LSU got some fantastic players, but talking to guys like Malik Neighbors, who talked about the conversations with current LSU players and their excitement for what could be in the near future in purple and gold, was really encouraging to me to hear that sort of positivity was still trickling out in player to player conversations. And so I think a lot of reasons to be optimistic that this could be building back to a national championship contention team in the next couple of years. And with some of the low numbers dynamics that we've hit on, with some of the struggles on the offensive line, both on the field this year, as well as recruiting numbers wise in the offensive line, I think to have those guys back and provide you some depth and sort of bridge that gap, having some experience come back up front. I think Ed Ingram's a fantastic lineman in particular that I did not anticipate being in purple and gold in 2021. And so to have some of those pieces in place to just kind of stay steady there, let some of these other young guys come along and, again, bridge that gap to the future, I think is huge.
And then on the flip side, staying in the trenches, Ali Gay, Dre Anthony, Neil Farrell, Glenn Logan all announced they're also coming back. And I don't know, man. It's cliche and it's not super, sexy to talk about, but winning that battle in the trenches is a major factor in some of these bigger games, especially when you talk about playing like the Alabamas of the world and some of those games where you just get beat. Either they're beating out your O-line, or you can't get pressure on their quarterbacks or running backs. To have all those guys come back, and again, we talked at the end of this past season, some of these young defensive tackles. It's a lot of depth. They're going to have a good rotation, and it seems like that's, again, more positive news, and a lot of guys that I didn't think would be coming back on both sides of the ball in both O and D line. So huge news for LSU. And this is a spot that they haven't been particularly strong at in getting some of these returning upperclassmen to come back who are draft eligible.
Yeah, everything you mentioned, it's not the sexiest positions on the field, but everything starts in the trenches. You have to have success up front. You have to have talent up front. You have to execute up front. You have to have depth up front if you want to compete at the level that LSU wants to compete at with the Alabamas and Clemsons and Ohio States of the world for national championship contention year in and year out. And we've seen, for all of the criticisms of the LSU quarterback position through history prior to Joe Burrow's last year in Baton Rouge, you can really look at the ups and downs of that program. And the best years, they had really good offensive and defensive lines. And the worst years, they struggled there. Regardless of who was taking the snaps, they struggled to protect them. And so incredibly exciting to see all those guys back. We talked a lot about it on the offensive side, but the defensive side, those four you mentioned, sounds like BJ Ojulari's back. Jaquelin Roy, who had some moments here as a freshman, back. That's big. Jacobian Guillory, some of those other guys that were young players on this year's team, and then the crew that they sign with Mason Smith and company all joining that fold. I think you're going to have a really fun defensive line rotation to watch in 2021.
Yeah, and at a school like LSU, you always think, and they've proven it really year in and year out, you're going to have strong skill position players, strong safeties, strong cornerbacks. So, again, we said it 3 times now, but it all starts in the trenches. And to have all those guys back, to have that rotation in case guys get hurt, in case something else happens, you think you feel pretty strong about a lot of the other positions. So this is, the foundation of what's going to become a pretty good team from what it looks like. Some of the key departures, Jabril Cox, Torrey Carter, Rayson McMath, Jacoby Stevens, and the one that I think we're going to personally miss the most is Zach Von Rosenberg, finally ending his LSU eligibility, hoping to go pro. But again, none of those super surprise me to be heading out. But it's going to be, I don't even know who the backup punter is at this point, if we're being honest. Zach's been there for so long, I don't even know who was going to fill that spot right now.
They may have had punters come and go just as his backup. On the depth chart this year, Avery Atkins was listed as the backup punter, and so that could be interesting. We've obviously seen him do some fantastic things as the kickoff man. Also, Peyton Todd, the West Monroe signee, joins the program. He might have ended up being the longest tenured signee in this 2021 class for LSU after some other shuffles. And he, similar to Zach, I mean, a big guy. At the high school level, he plays a lot of defense for the Rebels as well, or played a lot of defense for the Rebels, and comes down to Baton Rouge with a big leg and a lot of excitement to start his college career. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see him pretty early on. It'll be interesting to be looking at a punting position battle potentially in the fall, or hopefully later in the spring. But that'll be a position to watch after how high profile Zach Von Rosenberg made that position this past year or so.
Peyton Todd listed as 6'4", 210. So yeah, big boy back there. And then I guess the last thing before we close out, and I guess we'll have a little more once they make the defensive coordinator hire, but just kind of closing out the LSU recruiting class. I guess we're a little bit about almost exactly, a month away from the final signing day. Any thoughts or words on how LSU is going to try to finish this class? I know you mentioned O-line. They missed that on Tristan Lee, but any thoughts on how they want to close out these last 3-4 spots, however many are left?
Yeah, so they signed 20 in the early signing period, and then moments after midnight on New Year's Eve, Kimo Makanioli, another offensive lineman, committed. I think you still see some work to be done in that position group. And I thought they did a fantastic job in the early signing period, but I looked at them as incomplete until we saw more help up front on offense. And so I think we're looking at another couple of guys that they hope to bring in, even with Tristan Lee now heading to Clemson, that offensive line will remain a focus. And so Kimo on board becomes number 21. You have 4 spots remaining. Savion Jones, the defensive end, edge rusher from St. James, who was a commitment, who did not sign technically in the early period. I think you still expect him to be in the mix. And so that's 22. And I think you see another 2 offensive linemen, and then kind of a wild card, whether it's another receiver, another corner, another offensive lineman, and make it be 4 offensive linemen in this group. I think it's going to be interesting to watch that 25th spot and who they bring in. But if they can get a few offensive linemen, which remains a focus, then this class finishes a very strong recruiting class again, which is fantastic for LSU considering how uphill of a battle some of that could have been this fall with the way things went.
It's any grad transfers that you know of that they're looking at or talking to, or could one of those spots be filled by some grad transfers?
Yeah, I think there's a chance that we see a former Liam Shanahan Harvard teammate end up in Baton Rouge. I know grad transfers have been on that in terms of the offensive lineman board that LSU has been monitoring and keeping up with. There have been some grad transfers involved there, including Eric Wilson up at Harvard.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how they close this out. But yeah, I think you're right. If they can add a few O linemen, this is going to be a really, really strong class. Seems pretty safe. They're going to finish in the top 5, if not a little higher, maybe top 3 in the country. See how they close this out. But
and not to get too ahead of ourselves with stuff, but O mentioned recently the 2022 class in Louisiana is a really strong offensive line, and that's not typically been the case in recent years. And I think for the years that we have seen LSU struggle to have top tier quarterbacks at the helm, and people wonder how they can recruit these other positions so well and not get a quarterback, you look at what Louisiana produces, and they produce a heck of a lot of really talented defensive linemen, defensive backs, wide receivers, running backs. And so that's where LSU has really excelled on the recruiting trail, as positions that Louisiana produces at a high level. And offensive line has not historically been one of those positions. But if they can find that success and consistency with having the guys back that they're bringing back and finishing with some good signatures for 2021 and just, again, keep bridging that gap, 2022 could be a class that really sets up LSU very well for the years to come.
Is Louisiana good at producing receivers?
Oh, yeah.
Congrats to Devontae, man.
They've got another good bunch coming into Baton Rouge this year and are ahead of some folks in 2022. And I'm sure they would have loved to have kept that kid from a meet in state, but I was incredibly excited to see just a fantastic young dude, and to see him continue working his tail off the last few years and get to this point where he's the first Heisman receiver since 1991, I think speaks volumes to him, his talent and potential, and what he put into that game to reach those sort of heights. That it's an uphill battle to win that award as a not quarterback or running back. And fantastic job by Tay.
Yeah, and I saw you either tweet or post on something about people, get salty about seeing any sort of pro Bama content. But I mean, chill out, because the kid's from Louisiana, like you mentioned, he's an awesome kid. And then just the factor of, like you said, a receiver trying to win the award over all the plethora of quarterbacks and running backs who have won it recently. Just an awesome accomplishment. He had a fly suit too.
I was in this chair 3 years ago being threatened on Twitter because I was excited for him as a true freshman catching a championship winning touchdown against Georgia. And people were ready to meet me at Sonic and other places around town to go fight it out, because I was happy for a fantastic young man to have that moment in a game that LSU wasn't playing on the other side. And people did not take kindly to that. But I was pleased to see some more positivity his way around Louisiana last night. It seemed like predominantly a lot of support and, a well-deserved honor for Tay. Yeah,
a lot of times people forget these are human being kids, trying to make a living for themselves. But yes, that was awesome. And hopefully it won't be 8 more weeks until we catch up again. I would like to, next week, I guess we'll dissect if LSU's got a defensive coordinator and do a very early look at what is going to come for LSU next year. But until then, stay on track with Jarrett on Twitter at Jarrett Roser, and of course Tiger Details for all your recruiting news as LSU tries to close out this 2021 class in strong fashion. I'm on Twitter at MarkClements225, and of course, all the 225 magazine brands, Facebook.com/225 magazine, Instagram and Twitter at 225 Baton Rouge, and listen to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts: Spotify, Google Play Store, Apple Store, Buzzsprout, YouTube. We're everywhere. Thank y'all for listening, and we'll see you next week.